let's start the show. You already know who it is. My name is Mike Kyle, aka the Fantasy Vulture. I have over a decade worth of fantasy football experience and have continuously competed for fantasy championships over the course of the past 6 seasons. But enough of me, I'm here for you. On today's episode of the FB Show, we're continuing our All-32 NFL team preview series, breaking down every NFL team through the lens of fantasy football. And now we move on from the AFC North to the NFC West and the Seattle Seahawks, a team that I'm really excited to talk about today because there's a lot of great fantasy pieces on this offense. But before we get started, 3 quick things from you. First off, smash that subscribe button, power running back style, so you never miss a video from me. We're doing a video a day, every single day of the week. It doesn't matter if it's a weekend, if it's a weekday, if it's a Monday, or a Wednesday, or a Saturday. We're going to be here breaking down some fantasy football in order to help you win your league. Number 2, hit that like button like an open receiver downfield, Patrick Mahomes style. And then lastly, text me. Where's it at? There we go. 330-302-1554. That's going to be my hub for all of my fantasy football advice this season. So if you have any kind of question, because that's the reason why I wanted this so badly. Fantasy football oftentimes is a lot about context, right? We can throw up rankings and be like, hey, take player A over player B, but why? And team makeup and roster construction and matchups. It's all very intricate and it all just flows together. So trying to give one piece of advice like draft player A over player B doesn't work because there's so much more that goes into it on a week in, week out basis. But let's just jump right into it. I'm really excited about this team. It's a team that I have a lot of connections to, low key. So we're going to talk about that as well. Let's just go. We're going to start off with Russell Wilson. And Russell Wilson was an interesting case study last season. If you had him on your team, you might have gone good in this beginning and not so great to end. And so Russell Wilson, 2019, finished at quarterback 4. You're looking at that, you're like, that's really good, right? Right? Kind of. I mean, on the surface it looks good, but then we look at the weekly finishes, and he had 7 games as the QB1, 7 games as the QB2, and 2 games as the QB3. Now, the reason why this is important to note is because when you're talking about quarterbacks, you're probably only playing in a league, unless you're playing in Superflex, where you start 1. And if you're in a 12-team league, obviously that makes up the pool of the starting 12. So he finished outside of that starting 12 7 times. More than that, because that was just his QB2 performances. And then he also had a few QB3 performances, and it wasn't great. He started off the season red hot. I have his numbers pulled up here. So for the first, Russell Wilson, for the first 7 weeks, had 1, 2, 3. He had 4 games as a QB1. You can honestly say the first 6 weeks. He had 4 games as a QB1 for the first 6 weeks. For the rest of the season, he only had 3 games as a QB1. So he did all of his work for you early. He made your fantasy team look nice and good. And then he just kind of all of a sudden trailed off, especially as the year went on. However, he did help you in the championship in Week 15 if you play in a Week 15 championship. And then also in Week 17 if you play in a Week 17 championship. I should say Week 15 playoff is what I actually meant to say there. But it's one of those things, and Russell Wilson, he's so talented. And for me, he's the 3rd best quarterback in the NFL, behind Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson. But the issue is the offense holds him back. The whole narrative around Russell Wilson right now is hashtag let Russ cook. Because when he has the ball in his hands, we all know what kind of playmaker that he is. But this Seattle Seahawks team is just so ingrained in being a run-first football team and just kind of minimizing Russ in a very weird way. But then as the game progresses and they need Russ to make plays, they're going to give him the flexibility to do so. But they don't let him do that the entire game, which is very, very confusing. And on top of that, we've also seen the rushing numbers for Russell Wilson dip. I'm going to pull those up right now just to provide some context to that. But it's very odd. For a team that is so run first and has a quarterback with those rushing capabilities, for whatever reason, they don't utilize it as much as they used to. So I'm going to pull up his rushing numbers right now. And let's see. So these were some of his previous rushing numbers, and this was more so when he first entered the league. 489 rushing yards, 96 carries, 94 carries, 96 carries, 539 rushing yards, 118 carries, 849 rushing yards, 103 carries, 553 rushing yards. And then all of a sudden, like just over the course of the past few years, the rushing numbers are just down. 73 carries, 259 yards, 67 carries, 376 yards, and then last year, 75 carries, 342 yards. I don't know what happened. I really don't. I need to adjust my microphone. I know I'm peaking like hell right now. I apologize. I'm getting really excited. So if I did just hurt your ears there, I apologize. I'm going to try and tone it down just a little bit. So it's this weird case with Russell Wilson where he always finishes really high. Just because that's kind of the way that quarterbacks, and super talented quarterbacks nonetheless, always tend to do. Like, it's very easy for a good quarterback to finish highly in fantasy football, even a bad quarterback sometimes as well. We've seen that with Blake Bortles in the past. But the question for Russell Wilson is always how you get there is more important than how many points you end up scoring. Because if you're taking a quarterback, and we're going to talk about this right now, if you're taking a quarterback at QB6 in the 5th round, you better hope he finishes every single week, damn near every week. I mean, obviously there's some leeway there because you can't be perfect, but you better hope that he gives you 10 games at a minimum of a quarterback one, and we didn't even get that. In fact, we got worse than that, significantly worse than that. So it's just this interesting thing because you look at the adjusted score too. His points per game, he averaged over 20 points per game, which is incredible, but that's so inflated by the good games. I mean, he had a stretch of run earlier on in the season where it was like a game with 32 points, a game with 34 points, and then a game with 40 points. And that's obviously going to inflate the numbers a little bit, and it just wasn't pretty towards the end of the year. And like, you had to ask yourself this question as the year progressed is, are you afraid to face Russell Wilson if your opponent has him? I kind of think about this a lot, and this is the first player that I really get to articulate this with. When I'm looking at my matchup, I try and look for guys who can beat me, right? Guys that I am terrified can have a big game. Now, Russell Wilson predominantly falls in that category, but once you actually started looking at the numbers, like I've been saying here, where it's just like, more often than not, he's kind of hurting your fantasy team because he's finishing outside the top 12. I'm looking at that, it's like, I'm not scared of Russell Wilson. If he beats me and he has a boom game, like, fine, he's a great quarterback, that's to be expected. But if I'm looking at my matchup, I'm just not scared. I'm not scared of Russell Wilson anymore. For whatever reason, they've really just cemented him. I'm going to use this. I'm going to get yelled at. They've really cemented him into this game manager type role, even though he's so much better than that, because they are just so focused on using the run. And then just to get them out of crunch time, that's when they'll unleash the reins of Russell Wilson. However, all of that being said, I do have him ranked as my QB6, and that's more so just because of this offense and the weapons that they have, and not so much Russell Wilson himself, because I have been burned by Russell Wilson in the past. I think it was the first year. It was, was it 2016? Or was it 2017? One of the first years where his rushing totals decreased, that was the year that I finally caved on Russell Wilson, and then he ended up burning me. So I'm trying to be as even keel as possible, as level-headed about this. But the facts are that Russell Wilson has a tendency to kind of let you down, and the overall finish looks better than what the actual season ended up telling. So let's move on to the running back position here. And there's a few guys in this backfield. They just drafted DJ Dallas in the 4th and 5th round. They have Rashad Penny. But the guy that I really want to talk about is Chris Carson. Chris Carson, he's on my dynasty team. I traded Todd Gurley for him last season. And to me, it worked out great, except for the fact that I'm low-key scared of Todd Gurley in Atlanta this season, and that worries me because I think Gurley's going to have a monster year. But Chris Carson is one of the true and one of the last standing bell cow running backs in the NFL. He gets a ton of work. In 2019, he finished as the running back 9 in standard, running back 11 in PPR, 14 points per game on 15 games played until he broke his hip in week 16. And his new finish was running back 12, sorry. And so there's really not much of a change there. He was really good for your fantasy team last season. 7 games as a running back 1, 4 games as a running back 2, and 4 games as a running back 2, and 2 games as a running back 3. But I really just want to focus in on these numbers because the question was always, is Chris Carson going to get the receiving work? And while 37 receptions isn't a whole lot, it's a lot better than where it once was. So he had nearly 300 carries, 37 receptions, 1,200 rushing yards, just a monster on the ground, 266 receiving yards, and 9 touchdowns. Once again, this Seattle offense is just predicated on running the football. And when you get a guy like Chris Carson, who, yes, has a little bit of an injury history, but regardless is still just an absolute monster when he gets the ball, and he's going to get the ball 18 to 22 times a game. He's just a guy that is undeniably a fantasy. He's like kind of like a fantasy sledgehammer almost, because he's just a wrecking ball. In a way, he's very much like Derrick Henry in that sense, kind of like Derrick Henry light, if I were to give him some sort of comparison. But let's talk about his ADP because he is coming off of an injury. Like I said, a broken hip. He is expected to be ready for the start of the season. And that's kind of where you see the ADP where it's at. Running back 16, going in the third round at 305. I am ranked at running back 16 as well, so I'm right in line with ADP. And I tend to notice that I'm really typical. I think if I were to every 5 players, I'm probably right in line with ADP on 3 of them. How that happened, I don't know, because I make my rankings way before. Or I made my rankings way before I even looked at ADP for anybody. So it's been really interesting to go through and just kind of see where I'm in line with ADP as far as my own personal preferences. But back to what I was saying about Carson. He is just one of the true last standing guys who are going to get nearly 300 carries, 300 total touches each and every season. So with that being said, he is an excellent fantasy option because volume matters so much, on top of the fact that he is a super talented NFL running back. I'm going to pull up my rankings here, and I'll also pull up the ADP as well. So in terms of ADP, he's going ahead of Melvin Gordon, Devin Singletary, James Conner, Mark Ingram, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and we have to talk about Clyde Edwards-Helaire a little bit later in like a future video because oh my goodness. But then he's also going behind Kenyon Drake, Le'Veon Bell, Austin Eckler, Leonard Fournette. Of that, I think, do I have Fournette higher? I'm interested to find out where I have Fournette compared to Carson. Yeah, so I have Fournette and Carson back-to-back in my rankings. And for me, I don't know. I kind of don't know why that is. Now that I'm really looking at this, like, Seattle's a much better offense. They're both kind of injury prone, or they can be at least. They have an injury history, should I say. But I think ultimately it's just because Leonard Fournette is going to get even more work because they have such limited competition overall in Jacksonville. We saw what he did last year when there was nobody else around him and he was just a fantasy machine, even if they didn't really show it because he barely got in the end zone. It's just one of those things where it's more of a positive regression for Leonard Fournette this season. But regardless, I'm looking at this right now and I kind of have the same level of players around Chris Carson as the ADP, so that's always good. And for me, Chris Carson almost represents that tier break where you're looking at like Chris Carson, Melvin Gordon, and then you have that next tier break of David Johnson, James Conner, Mark Ingram, Le'Veon Bell. Overall, I really like Chris Carson this season again. And in fact, I feel like you're actually getting him at a value in the third round because of the fact that he is coming off of an injury. And a broken hip is nothing, like that is a serious injury, especially for, a running back who uses their legs pretty often. But I think at a third-round draft price, you're looking at a guy who's just going to get a ton of work and has the talent to finish as a running back 1, as we saw last season. But it's also important to note that Carlos Hyde I didn't make I have a player profile for him, but I didn't finalize it because the more I just thought about it, if Carson's expected to start the year, I don't think Hyde's going to play too much of a factor. But if for whatever reason that the Seahawks come out and they say Chris Carson's going to miss the first 3 weeks of the season, you need to draft Carlos Hyde. Like, if you just want to stash Carlos Hyde as your 16th round pick, and you just want to just have him rest on your bench until week 1 where we know for sure if Carson is active, I think that's actually an excellent draft strategy. Because if whoever has the Seattle backfield, whoever is in that backfield, whoever is leading the backfield, they are going to be valuable for fantasy football because of the way that this offense is structured. And Carlos Hyde finished last season as a running back 2 in Houston. So just something to keep in mind, just something to keep in the back of your head as we approach this season. And the other guy is Rashad Penny, but Rashad Penny blew out his ACL. I have him on my dynasty team as well. And so he's kind of dead for now. He's going to start the season on the PUP, so he won't be active for, I believe it's the first 6 weeks of the season. However, let's move on to one of my favorite draft discussions of 2020, and that is the Seattle Seahawks wide receivers. We're going to start off tried and true with Tyler Lockett. In 2019, he finished as the wide receiver 15 in standard, wide receiver 14 in PPR, 110 targets, 82 catches, over 1,000 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns. When you look at the weekly finishes, you also have to remember that he was a little bit banged up last season. He had a really bad leg bruise that kept him out. And by kept him out, I mean he played through it, but he wasn't great. He was kind of more so like a decoy than anything else. So he had 3 games as a wide receiver 1, 5 games as a wide receiver 2, and 1 game as a wide receiver 3. I don't know why I get through the first 2 perfectly fine, but then that third one always trips me up. Whatever the case, though. So then we look at the adjusted score, and the adjusted score doesn't necessarily do Tyler Lockett any favors. 12 points per game, 16 games played, and a new finish of wide receiver 24. So that puts him just on the fringe of a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 territory. But the question that you have to ask yourself is how much was Tyler Lockett hindered because of injury last season and just trying to battle through that leg injury. So I'm going to pull up his 2019 finishes by week. And this is going to really just fall in line with that injury because I'm looking at this now. He got injured, I believe it was in week 9. And actually week 9 was a wild week for both the Seattle Seahawks. But week 10, he finished outside the top 36. Week 11, outside the top 36. Week 12, outside the top 36. Week 13, outside the top 36. Week 16, outside the top 36. And their bye week was somewhere in there. I don't know specifically when their bye week was, but regardless, you're looking at a minimum 3 games. At a minimum 3 games where he was outside the top 36, and that's obviously going to absolutely kill his points per game. But we know what kind of talent that Tyler Lockett is. He's a guy that can make big plays, can stretch the field vertically, and he's just a great wide receiver in the NFL. And the reason why I like Tyler Lockett for fantasy is because he's consistently undervalued. How many times has Tyler Lockett been drafted in the 4th, 5th, and 6th round of your fantasy draft, and he ends up being a very safe wide receiver 2, probably in that range between wide receiver 14 and wide receiver 20, right? It happens every year, I feel like, with Tyler Lockett. And so when you have a player like this who is perpetually undervalued, kind of in that same vein as Jarvis Landry, it just makes a lot of sense to just wait to take him because you know he's going to drop in drafts. And that's not to mention the guy that we're going to talk about next, who is the new, almost a fantasy golden child now for fantasy analysts and just for fantasy football players and for NFL fans across the country. But going back to Tyler Lockett, his ADP is wide receiver 21, going in the back of the 4th, early 5th. I haven't ranked at wide receiver 20, and that is just because I do expect an improvement and a jump from DK Metcalf, who I'm so excited to talk about. But it really is just a matter of just kind of waiting and seeing for Tyler Lockett, because if I'm looking at the draft and I am on the clock in the 4th round, in the 5th round, let's see, I'm pulling up the ADP right now. Right, and so you're on the clock here. Stephon Diggs or Tyler Lockett? I will take I will take Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett or DJ Shark? Probably take Tyler Lockett. Deebo Samuel or Tyler Lockett? Definitely Tyler Lockett because we don't know how long Deebo's gonna be out. There's Odell. Odell's on the board. That's an interesting question. Do you take Odell or Tyler Lockett? Robert Woods or Tyler Lockett? That's also an interesting question. I lean. Ooh, where do I lean on that? Where do I have Robert Woods in my rankings? I have Robert Woods. I have Robert Woods at 18, Tyler Lockett at 20. So that is when the question becomes really which do you prefer? But other than that, you can kind of see what I'm saying here. Like there are just other like with Tyler Lockett, like he's being drafted in a spot to where it's very obvious that he is the player that you should be taking, and there's still a likelihood that he's going to slip somehow. Because for whatever reason, Tyler Lockett isn't like a sexy name, but he's just always been so consistent for fantasy football, and that's one thing that I really love about him, and why I'm actually considering him in pretty much all of my leagues this season, more so than ever, because we've seen it time and time again from him. Just because, like, that's the thing, right? He's not this major stat guy. Like, he's not a stat sheet stuffer. But again, this goes back to the whole Russell Wilson argument, where how you score your points is more important than how many points you score, because consistency is such a big key for fantasy football. Now let's talk about the Kalen Zacharias Metcalf, DK Metcalf, second-year wide receiver for the Seattle Seahawks on my dynasty team. 2019 finish, standard 30, PPR 32. His weekly finishes really weren't that great. 2 games as a wide receiver 1, 3 games as a wide receiver 2, 3 games as a wide receiver 3. Obviously, those are startable games. But what I'm really focused on right here are the stats from last year. As a rookie, this was a guy that a lot of people doubted his route running ability and his route tree. You know, a lot of people just labeled him as just an athlete where you're just going to kind of throw the ball up and he's going to go get it and make a play. So as a rookie, coming in with all that considered, as a rookie, came in 100 targets. Love that. Catches, 58. You don't love that, but he was one of the most targeted players in the red zone. And for whatever reason, he actually just didn't come down with a whole lot of touchdowns in that side of the field. 900 yards, love that too, especially for a guy who is just considered just this freak of nature athletically, but once again wasn't the route runner that a lot of guys wanted him to be. He, like, a lot of people just saw him as like a jump ball guy, right? And with 900 yards, he proved to be a little bit more than that. And 7 touchdowns, despite the fact that he was near the top of the league in red zone targets and didn't come down with a lot of touchdowns to begin with. So I think that number goes up. There's a lot to be excited about DK Metcalf, and where I have him ranked actually is lower than the ADP. ADP for DK Metcalf is wide receiver 19, going at 408, so he's going ahead of Tyler Lockett. I have him ranked as wide receiver 23. And that was just because as we saw DK Metcalf progress, and we've seen the breakout a little bit during the postseason when he had that monster game. But I'm very fearful of the fact that maybe we are trying to call the jump a year too soon. I think this is going to be a natural progression for Metcalf to where it's not going to be an overnight, like a 1 year boom, everything clicks, and then he just makes this leap into a wide receiver, into a middling wide receiver 2. I think it's going to take an additional year, and that's just because of the way that this offense is structured and set up, because they are still running the ball, because Tyler Lockett's still there and he's going to get 120 targets. But overall, I do think DK Metcalf's stats, everything's going to go up. I just don't think it's going to take the jump that a lot of people are projecting. And what's been actually really fun for me as a DK Metcalf owner is trying to figure out what his NFL career is going to look like, because I see the world where he's a top 10 wide receiver, but I also see the world where he's just a constant wide receiver 2, and there's such a major visual difference between the two. So trying to figure out what DK Metcalf actually is going to be for fantasy football purposes has been really fun. One of the things I've been considering and I've been in talks with for pretty much, 3 months now, is do I trade DK Metcalf for AJ Brown in Dynasty? So swapping the Ole Miss wide receivers. I think that's been a really interesting conversation I've had with the AJ Brown owner. We're both just trying to figure out where we see the other player and the other side of things. But regardless, for this year specifically, let's just pump the brakes on DK Metcalf. And the reason why I say that is because I'm not sure I would take DK Metcalf over Tyler Lockett in a vacuum. I think that really just comes down to where I'm at right now. And that's why this leads to where one of my favorite things that I was going to make a whole video series about this on is it was called This or That, and it was comparing two wide receivers from the same team. I kind of did this with the Cincinnati Bengals preview between Tyler Boyd and AJ Green, but just give me the guy that is going later in drafts. Just give me the guy that falls me, because you're looking at two wide receivers here who are extremely talented and are probably going to finish around the same range. And with that being said, there's no reason to try and reach for one over the other. Just let the draft board fall as it may and take the guy that ends up in your lap, because that's going to be better value than the guy that you end up reaching for maybe around early or even at the ADP, knowing that you can get the other guy if you just wait a little bit longer. And finally, we're going to talk about the tight end position for the Seattle Seahawks, because the tight end position for the Seahawks, for whatever reason, Russell Wilson loves tight ends, and he loves them enough to where Will Disley's relevant all the time. Luke Hollister, Jake Hollister? Luke Hollister? Why am I blanking on what his name is? Hollister, we'll leave it at that, is relevant week in and week out. But they finally brought in a new tight end, and that is Greg Olsen over from the Carolina Panthers. And I mentioned this in the Carolina Panthers preview, but Greg Olsen was really good last season, and he had a lot of targets, and he had a lot of work, and a really bad offense. And now that you throw him in Seattle, a team that does utilize the tight end, and a position that Russell Wilson throws to, I think Greg Olsen has some sneaky upside this year, despite being an old man. So his 2019 finish was 15 in standard, 13 in PPR, 82 targets, 52 catches, 597 yards, and 6 touchdowns. You look at those weekly finishes, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. 4 games of the tight end 1, 5 games of the tight end 2, and 3 games of the tight end 3. Obviously, you aren't really going to start those. Obviously, those tight end 3 numbers aren't the best, but the tight end 2 numbers, depending on where he finished that week, they look better. And then just having 4 games of the tight end 1, despite his age, is still really, really impressive. When you take his adjusted score, 14 games played, 7 points per game, new finish of tight end 13, so nothing changes with the PPR. And where do you have him ranked as far as ADP goes and my own ranking? So I have him ranked at tight end 20, and that was just because we've seen how valuable that tight ends can be with Will Disley last season. I owned him in Dynasty, and he was just a touchdown machine. So you're going to put Greg Olsen on a team that moves the football, gets into the red zone a lot, and a quarterback that likes to throw to the tight end position. On top of the fact that Greg Olsen is just an incredible receiving tight end and always has been, I like the upside here. I don't know, to me, I think Greg Olsen kind of serves more as a weekly streamer than a guy that you'd roster consistently. But I think there is a world where you can just get a consistent 50 yards from Greg Olsen and the potential for a touchdown every single week. So that has me really interested if you want to punt the tight end position and take Greg Olsen with your very last pick, because he's going to be there. His ADP is tight end 24, so literally he's free in drafts going in the 14th round. And so if you do want to just stack up, maybe you play in a league with kickers and defenses, and you want to take your 14th round pick and use that on a kicker, your 15th round pick, and use that on a defense, and then your final pick on the tight end, because you know that you can get Greg Olsen super late, and you can load up with Harrison Butker as your kicker, and the Ravens defense, in the 15th round. To me, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's an interesting strategy if you want to take a guy who's definitely an older player, but has still been fantasy relevant for as long as we can remember, and is actually put in a better position this season than he was last year. But I think that's going to do it for our Seattle Seahawks preview. I'm like, what team am I talking about here? But for the Seattle Seahawks, this is an offense that I'm really excited about, because they do have a lot of fun I think that's just the thing, right? They have a lot of fun pieces. Watching Russ cook is super special. Watching them just carve up I can't talk now. Watching them carve up the field and just give the ball to Chris Carson, carry after carry after carry, that's super fun. They have two incredible wide receivers and just an up-and-coming superstar in DK Metcalf. And then last but not least, they've always just been this great, solid red zone team that looks to throw the ball to the tight end position as well. So there's a lot of fantasy value on this team every single year, and that's why I love talking about them. This division, the NFC West, is going to be one of my favorite series of previews to do because all of these teams have a lot of fantasy pieces on them. But that's going to do it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. We're doing this every single day, Monday through Sunday. That's 7 days a week, if you didn't know the math there. And then also, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I already said that. I don't know where I'm going with this. Anyways, I will see you back here tomorrow as we cover the Arizona Cardinals. Oh, that's going to be fun. Oh, baby. I just got really excited for that. All right. Remember, people come and go, but fantasy championships are forever. I'm out. Later.